Hello, historians. This is the story of Rodolfo Corky Gonzales. As I tell you the story, I want you to take notes. And here's how I want you to take notes. Take a piece of paper and fold it in half. On one half, I want you to write at least 5 examples of historical context. So, historical themes, events, or other information surrounding one person or one event. So our person today is Corky, and you're going to be looking for examples of historical context in his story. On the other half, I want you to write at least 5 biographical details, 5 facts about Corky that are unique to him. So on one side, you've got the historical surroundings of Corky's life, and on the other, you have Corky himself. So let's begin. This is the story of Rodolfo Gonzales, who was also called Corky. Corky Gonzales is considered one of the leading voices of the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s. Corky was born in 1928 in Denver, Colorado. He was the son of migrant workers who farmed throughout the American Southwest. In the early days of Corky's life, it was also the early days of the Great Depression. The Great Depression, which began in the late 1929 and early 1930, saw an increase of Mexican-born laborers and Mexican immigrant laborers booted out of their jobs almost immediately. They were among the first people who were cut from their labor and their employment. The 1920s was also a moment of great xenophobia. Xenophobia is spelled with an X, and it's a word to mean extreme hatred or fear of immigrants or fear of nationalities not of your own. So depending on kind of where you stand, your version of xenophobia might be different from somebody else's. But the 1920s, a couple pieces of information. In 1924, the Border Patrol was first established in America. And the 1920s also saw a huge increase in white terrorist organizations and their activities, including, but not limited to, the Ku Klux Klan. This is because there was a sentiment among many white Americans that immigrants, like Mexican immigrants, Chinese immigrants, and their children, were bringing about threats to American jobs and livelihood. Now, this was a sentiment. It wasn't necessarily a fact, but it was really pervasive among particularly working class whites. When Corky was little, early in these days of the Great Depression, of xenophobia, and in his life, he was only 2 years old, his mother died. Corky had 7 brothers and sisters, and his dad never remarried. So when Corky was 10, he began working in the fields with his father. Many of his siblings did. The family moved around the country with the seasons looking for work. So during his early childhood, Corky attended 4 grade schools, 3 middle schools, and 2 high schools, all during an era of assimilation. Assimilation in American history was kind of the belief that people of color and people of a different national descent were expected to sort of blend in to American white culture. Corky looks back on this time and believes that forced assimilation, that period that he was in school during assimilation, tried to teach him, quote, to forget Spanish, forget my heritage, forget who I was. When he was only 16 years old, Corky graduated from Manual High School in Denver. This was a rarity for Mexican-American youths at the time, and the fact that he graduated so young shows us that he was a determined young man. He was also very, very smart. Within a year of graduation, Corky was recruited to join the military or the migrant laborer workforce in support of World War II. So he had 2 options. He could either go into the military or he could work on behalf of the American military through his migrant work in the fields. This was also the same year that he was recruited to join the military was the year of the Zoot Suit riots, which was a moment in LA, in Los Angeles, where servicemen, Mexican immigrants, and white civilians, along with Mexican-American citizens, had extreme clashing in the streets of Los Angeles. And ultimately, the people who were brutalized the most were the young Mexican-American teens. So this is the time that Corky is a teen himself. He's watching teens in Los Angeles be beaten, in some cases to death, but mostly just beaten to a bloody pulp by American servicemen. So this is kind of the world that he's living in at the time. This contributed to Corky's disdain and distrust of American politics and leadership. Another cool thing about Corky is that he was an avid boxer. He was an athlete, and he was known for his agility and his speed in the boxing ring. He was actually a local hero in Denver. He was the featherweight boxing champ at a very young age. He becomes a bar owner and bail bondsman in Denver at the time. These are highly sought after positions in communities of color, because oftentimes people who are arrested are not able to secure bail through white resources. They have to find other people who will loan them money. So here's Corky, a Mexican-American citizen who is loaning or bonding out money to people who need it, who couldn't get it anywhere else. He also runs for public office. He's the first Latino in Denver to ever do this, and he runs against the first Black man to ever do this. He's just a magnanimous and magnetic person. People want to be associated with Corky. He's also really opinionated. This draws the attention of John F. Kennedy Jr. In 1957, JFK has a group on behalf of his campaign called Viva Kennedy. And it's a group of his campaign that's meant to recruit Mexican-American voters and support among the Latino community. So Kennedy appoints Corky as the first Latino ever, not only on behalf of Viva Kennedy, but he also is appointed as the district captain of the Democratic National Convention. This is a huge deal in American and local politics. He stays involved in government and politics. In 1965, so, almost 10 years later, President Johnson begins something called the War on Poverty. And Corky is appointed to advocate on behalf of Denver's poor. But he gets fired really quickly thereafter because people in the city complain that he's too focused on the needs of Chicanos and Latinos. And actually, just the word Latino, the word Chicano comes up in a moment. In protest of getting fired from this job because he is blamed for, or it's believed that he's working only on behalf of Latinos, Mexicans, and Mexican Americans, Corky organizes a rally. He calls this meeting, it's a meeting, right? A rally and a meeting. He calls this meeting the spark of a crusade for justice. During this time, during the 1950s and 60s, Corky, who, as I mentioned, is really smart, he's a writer, he's a reader, he begins reflecting on the history of what he calls Mexicanos. So Mexico, right? Mexicanos in the United States. He reflects on their native heritage, the fact that among many of the people he knows that are called Mexican, they actually can trace their genealogy to the American Southwest, not to Mexico as we know it. He reflects on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is essentially the moment when America claims the majority of the Southwest and parts of even into Colorado. He begins thinking about the Californios, right? The Mexican and sort of Mexican, but they weren't really Mexican. They were Latino and mestizo. They have mixed heritage. It's a word that was claimed at the time. Who were living in California and called themselves Californios. The same of Tejanos, right? People who were living and were raised in what we call today Texas, who never saw themselves as Mexican. They saw themselves as Tejano. Most of them had what we see as Mexican blood now, but mixed race blood or native blood. And Hispanos. This is the same word, same kind of concept applied to people like those of us living in Arizona, right? People who were living in what was then New Mexico territory, Hispanos. He also thinks back on the tale of a man named Joaquin Murrieta, which is a Mexican sort of or Latino California bandit in Southwest lore, who is believed to kind of be like the Mexican-American version of Robin Hood, someone who terrorized the conquerors on behalf of the people who were being conquered. So he's reflecting on all this. He's thinking about his brief moment in politics, and he's thinking about this big rally that he's organized. And he organizes a huge group of people in Denver and throughout the Intermountain Southwest called the Crusade for Justice. And it is a movement on behalf of Mexican American, and Native priorities. At the exact same time, really, in American history, that you have civil rights movements on behalf of African Americans, you have women's rights movement on behalf of mostly white women, but women are trying to work together with women of color as well. And probably a better known civil rights hero to you, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. This is all happening at the same time. And in this moment, Corky sits down and he writes this incredible poem. And believe me when I tell you that it is an epic poem. This poem is several pages long. I mean, maybe 25 pages long. And in it, he references all of those things. His native heritage, the fact that he believes himself to be not just Mexican or Mexican American, but also of mixed race heritage with Native Americans. He reflects on the drawing of the boundaries of the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty. He thinks about the Californios and the Tejanos and the Hispanos. And he thinks about this bandit, Joaquin Murrieta, who terrorized essentially the white conquerors throughout California for many years. And he titles his poem, Yo soy Joaquin, I am Joaquin. And in it, he coins the term Chicano. It's the first time this word is used in academic publication, and it gives a name to what we know of as the Chicano movement, which is more than just a rights movement or a labor movement. It is an identity movement. It is a movement for a term we know of better today, racial and social justice. So you should have been able to hear quite a few examples of historical context and quite a few examples of Corky's biographical details. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you look forward to writing your own story about someone in local or national history.